This morning we will be continuing our study on the book of Acts, kind of winding down here. We're up to chapter 22. We'll be knocking out chapter 22 today. Before we begin, we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll do a little background as to where Paul is in his mentality leading up to chapter 22, and then jump right into chapter 22. So, you know, at first glance, some may ponder the question, why did God allow Paul, the apostle, his representative, to be arrested and taken to prison on multiple occasions? Would not his worldwide evangelistic work for him be curtailed by his imprisonment? This is, kind of reminiscent of the age-old question, why does God, quote unquote, allow bad things to happen to good people? More specifically, those who are in his kingdom. Well, the answer to this question must be found in understanding who God is and how he works, which is now through his word, his providential care, through men and through circumstances, not by miraculous means. Joseph himself spent some of the best years of his life in prison, and he was a righteous man. But God used him even in that prison to accomplish his will. In the same manner, Paul wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon while he was in prison. We see that in Acts 28, verses 30 and 31, showing that he too was used in accomplishing God's will. Now, with all that being said, we do have to acknowledge the fact that God is all powerful. He is omnipotent, and his power cannot be limited to or measured by mere imprisonment. At any time, God could have taken those two out of prison and placed them wherever he'd like them to be. And we see that in the situation with Paul and the jailer back in Acts 16, 27 through 34, where God intervened. But for those specific instances, this is how God chose to handle it, and who are we to question God? This is the same God who spoke the universe into existence, the same God who made man from dust of the earth and breathed life into our lives. This is a power that our finite minds cannot fathom. We also can't discredit what Paul taught us through his imprisonment. He taught us that even chains of bondage can be used for the glory of God. In Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, it says, therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom also we have access by faith into his grace wherein we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope, and hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given unto us. Certainly, Paul's imprisonment, as we read in this passage here, would be counted among those tribulations he mentions here in this passage. And he said that we should glory in those tribulations, just as do we glory in our tribulations, brother? But why should we glory in our tribulation? It says right here in the passage, why should we glory in our tribulation? Because it works patience, it produces experience. The New King James Version says perseverance, which ultimately strengthens us and makes us focus more intently on that promised hope that lies ahead. Brother, And seeing that Christians do the opposite sometimes, run into tribulations instead of learning to be patient for the situations, instead of growing wisdom from another situation, we become impatient. We do the example opposites sometimes. Brother Mike?
Yeah, it's the same problem that's addressed in Romans chapter 9. About God rejected Israel, God raising up Pharaoh at one point. Uh, but it would be said of Pharaoh, he said, from scripture said unto Pharaoh, the same purpose that I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name I will declare throughout all the earth. So even when we're going through our tribulations, just like Israel were, it resulted in God's name being glorified. And his name being you know, people after Israel was delivered that went through everywhere you went, people were talking before. Well, people that go on with God showing even the true God. Absolutely. So overall, this is a situation where Paul exemplifies how a Christian is to react when in unfavorable situations, whether God intervened miraculously and bailed him out or not. And that is where the lesson lies. Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of UK, was quoted saying, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." We can most certainly tweak that quote, a little and give it spiritual connotation. Perhaps we might say that the pagan sees difficulty in every opportunity, while a Christian sees opportunity in every difficulty. Or at least that's the way it should. Brethren, this is the mindset that we should all be striving to have. You can just see through Paul's attitude and his actions just how much he loves Christ, the gospel, and the church, even through the trials and tribulations. So that's where we are here. Just doing a little digging into Paul's mindset. We see his examples leading all the way up until this point. So there's no surprise how he treats this situation. Comments or questions before we move into our lesson? Let's turn with me to the book of Acts, chapter 22. Acts 22. We'll begin our study here this morning. We're going to look at Paul's speech to the crowd. Paul's speech to the crowd. So, in our lesson last week, chapter 21, Brother Chris, we see that some hostile Jews, having seen Paul near the temple, pounced on the opportunity to accuse him of taking a Gentile into the temple. They arrested him and started beating him. We see that in Acts 21, verse 27. And in effect, he was ironically rescued by the Roman soldiers who arrested him. You know what could have happened to Paul if they had taken him out of that crowd and arrested him and kind of pulled him away from the people. Paul would then go on to explain to the commander who he was, which was an innocent Jew from Tarsus, not an Egyptian revolutionary. And you can see that kind of through the passages, how he was explaining himself in chapter 21. Afterwards, he was granted permission to speak. He then quieted the crowd, and the people listened attentively, and he began to speak to them in Hebrew or Aramaic. This is where we are in chapter 22 now. Let's look at his opening words as Paul begins to give his defense. If I could read it for verses 1 and 2. Verses 1 and 2. And when they heard that these people taunted him, they kept the more silent. He said, I am verily a man which am born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city, and free of humility.
This one. Take it right. No, you did. Thank you, brother. We're going to put focus on verse 1. So, now keep in mind, this
This was after Peter was just beaten by these people. And here he was standing before them, detained, currently in chains. And how does he address these vicious Jews? What did he say? I'm sure Paul could have thought of some other things to call them that were more fitting, but he still managed to address them with respect as he pleaded with them to hear out his defense. Paul was focused and measured in defending his actions and was readying himself to present the truth. He could have easily become angry at the way he was unjustly being treated, but Paul understood that exchanging evil with evil will get you absolutely nowhere. I'm going to get you, Brother Mike. Let's read what Paul says in Romans 22, verses 17 through 21. 17 through 21. Romans 22. Oh, sorry, excuse me. I think it's that. Well, let me read it here. So I already have to hold it here. I'll have to find out which chapter that is. So it says in the book of Romans, Paul writes to the church of Rome, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give peace unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12. Thank you. But Mike, no comment? Yes.
Opening remark, uh, the thing when we,
Great tackle.
he's really kind of from the corner. We'll see that as it goes on. I ain't gonna get into it, but the fact that he goes and looks at was rendering and Bob. That Bob was really heightening the respect that he had for them and tried to, show them, hey, I'm not trying to do anything to harm you. I'm one of you. And you're gonna see that come out, man, when we start talking. It is really strategic.
Absolutely. Yes. That passage was Romans 12, 17. Thank you, church. Romans 12, 17 through 21. Brethren, look at the different phrases Paul uses. Look at these different phrases. He says, recompense to no man evil for evil. So that means when somebody is using foul language or cussing you out, don't you turn back around and do the same. Don't do the same back to them. A lot of people have that mentality, tit for tat. You do it to me, I'm gonna do it to you. No, it's not the Christian's mentality. We are to react differently. We are a peculiar people sanctified unto Christ. He said, avenge not yourselves, for it is written, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. He says, if your enemy hunger and thirst, feed and give him drink. He said, be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Brethren, we are living in a time where evil is overcoming man day by day. And it is even claiming some members of the Lord's church. It's easy to act civil when you're among brethren, among people who love and care about you, but how do we act behind closed doors? How would we react when placed in an unfavorable situation, just as Paul was? When it comes to our temperament and having the patience and wisdom to handle these situations, we need to turn to the Lord
and keep our gaze fixated on his teachings so that we will better equip ourselves to be ready whenever these situations arise, just as Paul. Paul was most certainly ready, and he exemplified it through his life and the faith, and we will see it in our studies here this morning. Paul was the perfect picture of practicing what he preached. With that being said, let's continue our study. Let me get a reader for verses 3 through 5. Verses 3 through 5 as we make our way down
Born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all ought to stay. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering unto prisoners both men and women. And also the high priest does bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem, for to be punished.
What is Paul? What's Paul doing here? So kind of goes back to what Brother Mike was touching on. Here we see Paul bringing up his past and describing how he used to treat disciples of Jesus. He explained how he persecuted unto death and delivered both men and women into prison. He also stated that he was zealous for God, just as they were. But we know that the Jews, just like Paul in his past, had a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. Paul says in Romans 10, verses 1 through 3, Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. So we see where this type of mentality eventually leads the Jews. But at the current moment in Acts 22, Paul was making a conscious effort to convey that he too was like them at one time. He was a persecutor of Christianity in his past. But what happened, Paul? What happened? What happened? Let's look at verses 6 through 16. If I get a reader there, I know that's a long passage, but we'll go to verses 6 through 16. Brother Mike.
That all make sure you know, and will so now you're doing something that seems to go against it. That means y'all need to listen. I'm about to check it. I'll say, don't too much things listen to me. Melian was a highly respected teacher, he was passed by this time, but he was a highly respected teacher. So Paul really, he showed his education and then he showed his dedication to the law in one verse. Very, very.
Look at verses 6 through 16. 6 through 16.
As I made my journey and was come nigh to the master, about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light around God. And I fell unto the ground and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said unto me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. They that were with me saw indeed the light, were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? The Lord said unto me, Arise, and go to Damascus, and there it shall be told thee all the things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, and to the report of all the Jews, well, came unto me and stood and said unto me, Brother Saul, retrieve thy sight. And the same hour I looked upon him, And he said, the God of our fathers hath chosen thee, thou shalt know his will, and see that just one, and shalt hear the voice of his mouth. Thou shalt be his witness to all men of what thou hast seen and heard. Now, why tarriest thou? Rise, be baptized, wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord.
So going back, going back to those first five verses, I just want to make sure we looked at and notated those first two arguments. So the first two arguments were to express that he was a proud Jew, uh, Paul, and the second argument was that he too was a persecutor of Christianity. Also, in the previous verses 1 through 5, we see what Paul reasoned with the people. Again, in so many words, he was letting them know that he understood where they were coming from because he too, at one point, shared the same passions and convictions as they did. However, in this passage, you can kind of see where Paul starts to make a separation. In this passage, he begins to discuss the event that took him from a life of sin and forged him toward a life of righteousness. Third statement he made and expressed was the fact that he is now a Christian. He shared the circumstances of his conversion and the reason he was now preaching the gospel. In verses 6 and 7 on the road to Damascus, he said that he saw a great light. And the light was so bright that it blinded him, and as he fell to the ground, excuse me. Now we know up to that point, that Paul was infamously known for persecuting Christians, just as he stated to the Jews. He would break into Christian homes and drag them away to prisons, and sometimes it would even result in death. And he did so with a clear conscience. So this is what Paul was doing to people. This is what Paul was doing to Christians. But with that being said, and I think it's always important to note when we go over these passages here, reading about Paul's trip on his road to Damascus. When Jesus spoke to Paul, did he ask him, "Why do you persecute us, these fine people?" He didn't say that. Did Jesus ask, "Why do you persecute Christians?" No, no, no. Jesus made it real personal, didn't he? Made it real personal. Jesus made it real personal. He said, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Why persecutest thou me?" Jesus made it extremely personal because it was personal. Everyone listening this morning needs to keep this in mind. And that is, when you persecute Christians in the Lord's church, you are persecuting Christ himself. And how blessed are we for Christ to think that much of us? This is yet another passage that vividly shows how much Christ and his church are connected. You cannot have one without the other. His church was purchased with his blood, Acts 20, verse 8. And in order to get into his church, you must obey his gospel and be buried with him in baptism and arise to walk in newness of life. Romans 6, verses 3 through 7. And then Christ himself adds you to the church. Acts 2:47. The same church that was purchased and covered with his blood. It all comes full circle. It all comes full circle. Again, the church and Christ are intertwined, and you cannot separate the two. Comments or questions before moving on?
Unfortunately, in there may be a misunderstanding who was in the church any kind of time. Really, they disassociate Christ from the church. You know, you hear some people say, "Well, I have Christ." No, they're not as much concerned about the church. But then comes this teach as this shows that the church in Christ are itself. And that he told Paul, as you had mentioned, why persecute thou me. Yeah. And so we are members of his body. And so, and there's another fact, and as being brethren, we need to be careful that we don't persecute the master. So we need to be careful with that. It's how we speak about our brother or sister in Christ. All of represent those lively stones. Well, our presence in need and insight, because if you mentioned Acts 20:28, he gave me shed his blood, sure, good blood. That's what makes us so precious. So, I've always said we need to learn to fall in love. Yes. We're around enough ungodly all people. Yes, well, we ought to be glad we come together. I need to see somebody that has this hope because I'm hey, we said thank God, but then we're supposed to be that meeting like as well to let them know there is that hope, as in the book of Ephesians, that one represents in both things. We need to thank God for the church. Matter of fact, until we grow in the church.
Bouncing off what Maxwell said, not only is there a danger outside of disconnecting Christ and the church, but there's a danger inside.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people think that, they get upset about something, I'm leaving the church. Just can't leave the church and don't think you can live right. Because it's all himself. And a lot of times we hear people say, I love the church. I don't need church or whatever. Because they're angry with something or maybe some bad happen. But you need the church. You believe in Christ.
Yes. That's it.
So if that's your mindset, put it that way.
Absolutely. Great point. I'm trying down.
That whole scenario is thinking that they just in the church, believing in Christ and his church. Yes. Great.
Church. And if you were at average, in fact, we have a challenge to go to church. Whereas the average person, we go to six weeks. So inherently, that church. So it's not always not one goal, one more practice. I love church. If I don't love church, really. You got to understand that. So if I've got to try to push members of the body of Christ to need a church, we got a problem already. Yes. What's Christ? What is scripture about?
Don't have fellowship.
I'd rather have. Well, I know I'm talking. And one thing I try to stress that being told the elder here as well. We're in John chapter 3 and 4. It would be Christian well said. We're in the epistle of John. We're in John because John talks about us loving our brethren. And so it gives us a perspective of how God feels about it. That's right. If you have a problem loving your brethren, you have a problem. Yes, you do. You have a problem. And you need to examine your heart. And before you start looking at your brethren, you need to check yourself out first. Because something is for this. To the point where we hear about the love of God, where in Romans chapter 5, Paul said, where the love of God is shed abroad in your heart. But that's through patience and faith, wherein we come to learn God. It would hurt to learn more about God. we become more appreciative, realizing that we came to the cross, man, filthy, wretched, and God cleaned us up. And so, in that appreciation, how dare we look at our brother, scorn and have discord, try to take him apart and make him look bad and all this when we're told to provoke unto love and good work. There. And so we should be trying to build up our, I think our brother in that. We see enough of that before. But in praying, we should be striving for that. Jesus said in John 13, 34, 35. Here is a new command that love one another just as I have loved you. That's right. And not in the sense that that was good, but the scope of it was going to change. So you think all of them come from different backgrounds, and we learn to love one another and have all things in common, as it says in Acts chapter 2. That's why we need to be so closely knitted. We depend on one another. Paul was talking about that great unity in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We're all members of one another. We need one another. Every one of us needs one another. And we cannot go about and be disassociated from the church because I'm this wrong and you don't have any fellowship as Brother Craig is about to talk about on Wednesday night, that fellowship. You know, when someone gets baptized, first thing I tell them, you need to pray. Then I say you need to study. And then you need to develop your fellowship with your brother. Now, those you used to hang with, you know, well, God has called you out from amongst them now. And now you have to live a sanctified life and a holy life, which is something you learn. Yeah. Nobody come up out there and want to automatic sanctified as maybe a more mature Christian might be. It takes time. And so then we have to be patient with our brother. Give them time in the fellowship.
Fellowship comes in. Actually, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, brother. Brother Mike, you're great. Great. Thank you. Comments?
Church. You know, what was in the mind of God, what redemption bringing about city of this whole idea of the church. But being real separated from the human side. So y'all problem is not so what that body of Christ, that institution, that church, blood bought, you know, Christ coming back. And we love that aspect of it. The human side. Yeah. And so we try to compartmentalize that. It's not the all kind of things. That's what makes us say something that's unsavory things comes to the church. We're really talking about the people who make up the church, and therein lies our issue. But we don't want to work that it takes in order for us from those kind of things. Yes. And extending, you know, long suffering, patience, all that Christian graces, all that's what's going to take in order to appreciate even that portion of it as well. Yes. Wasn't saying that a perfect institution, they never. You know, it's that we will say it from time to time, so that should discourage someone to leave Christ altogether. We make mistakes.
Yeah, I don't want to take too long. Really good, Maxwell, hit on kind of what I was going to say, but with the church, it's we got to put work in to be able to get along with our brothers and sisters, right? We are thinking. It's just like a family. You have problems in your family, but you don't run out from your family. You know, you work together and make it work. In the same way, it has to be in the church. And either in Colossians or Ephesians, I forget which one it is, but it says that we're supposed to be long suffering toward our brothers, forgiving one another, as God, for Christ's sake, forgave us.
Yes.
If we forget how much we have been forgiven, then we're not gonna be willing to put the work in to give our brother to be long suffering toward them. You got a problem with a brother, invite him to your house.
Yes.
Get to know him.
That's where that,
Be friends with and learn how to be friends with. We gotta put the work in. But a lot of times we don't want to. We just want to just miss that person and move on.
that's where learning that little prayer comes in.
You know, if we just truly sit and think of how many times Christ forgave us, you would think we would develop a different type of mentality, a different type of love towards our brethren. You would think so. But let's move on here. So in verses 8 through 16, Paul continues to give an account of the event. We see where Jesus would send him to Damascus, where he meets Ananias, a devout man with a good report. Verse 13 drives home that point because we see the Spirit working through him as he helped Saul regain his sight. Ultimately, Saul will go on to be buried in the watery grave of baptism. This is the same man who was persecuting Christians for years and considered himself to be the chief of sinners. You see that in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 15. He was now a Christian and servant of the Lord. What a beautiful, inspirational story. The gospel can truly change anyone. And here was Paul standing before the Jews as a living example. Now, you would think they would be happy. He turned his life around. But we will see here shortly just how they react. Let me get a read of verse 17 through 21. Verse 17 through 21.
I was coming into Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. Current saying unto me, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem. I said, Lord, you know that I am present and beaten, synagogue them that believe on thee. And when the blood of my martyrs Stephen was shed, this is by sent to you to this day, and kept the ranking of them that slew him. And he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence to the Gentiles.
Thank you, Mike. So this passage ended up being Paul's fourth and final argument, where he gives an account of how he became an apostle of Jesus Christ. Here we see him explaining his reasons for doing evangelistic work among the Gentiles, evidently intending to vindicate his conduct in Jerusalem and elsewhere. Paul wanted to show the divine authority that had changed him from a persecutor into a preacher. He went on to discuss how he fell into a trance and Jesus came to him telling him to leave Jerusalem. So here we have a tale of two different perspectives. The way Paul looked at the situation while he was in Jerusalem, he saw it as an opportunity because he was in good with the people. And being that he was persecuting Christians and even played a huge role in putting Stephen to death. As a result of his past life, he thought that the people and the others he had relationships with in the upper offices would be more susceptible to the gospel, being that he would be the one teaching it. Notice I said he thought, but Jesus knew that they wouldn't receive him well, just as we see here in Acts 22. Ultimately, Jesus' answer to Paul was, go. And he sent him far away to the Gentiles. This is why Paul was known as an apostle to the Gentiles. We see that in Galatians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Now, of course, with everything being hindsight, as if we even had to use hindsight, we knew who had the better perspective. Jesus, of course. Jesus is going to always have the better perspective, the better decision, the better direction. He is the all-knowing divine master teacher. Paul will go on to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, and as a result, many men and women were converted. He helped set up and establish several congregations. He established close relationships with the brothers and sisters and taught them through his words and actions how to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. You can see throughout the New Testament all the fruit that came from Paul's preaching, but we can trace it back to Christ telling him first to depart from Jerusalem. Now, in the same verse, Paul made a statement that triggered them instantly. Let's not forget what they were accusing him of. Let's go back Let's go back to Acts chapter 21 and verse 27 and 28. Acts 21, 27 and 28 says, and when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, carrying out men of Israel help. This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law, and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. They said Paul was polluting the temple by bringing Gentiles in there, and he was teaching all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place being the temple. Now, going back to chapter 22, as Paul continues to give an account of what happened back in chapter 9, he says in verse 21 that Jesus commanded him to go to the Gentiles. Now we have to understand that these Jews were just chomping at the bit, waiting. They were waiting for Paul to say something so they could pounce. At times we may find ourselves in these situations where the person or persons you are trying to have a conversation with is only listening to what they want to hear. When it gets to that point, all logic, all reason goes right out the window. And they, like these Jews, thinking purely on emotion and or hatred. In the end, it should seem like they were only looking for, excuse me. In the end, it would seem like they were only looking for Paul to say the magic words so they could persecute him. You see, an honest heart would have looked at Paul, thought about his past life, contrasted it with his current state, and considered how much he had changed. The honest heart would have listened to his speech with spiritual glasses instead of looking for words to justify his condemnation in their eyes. With that being said, let's read how they responded to Paul's defense. Let me get a reader from verses 22 through 24.
Excuse me.
22.
And they gave him audience unto this word. And then lifted up their voice and said, away such a fellow from the earth, for it's not fit that he should live. And as they cried out and cast off their clothes and threw dust in the air, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the council and bade that he should be examined by scoring, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him.
These people were crazy. Absolute crazy. They were casting their robes and clothes off. They threw dust in the air. They were enraged, to say the least. When the chief captain sees their reaction, verse 24 tells us that he commanded Paul to be brought into the castle to quiet the mob down and give orders for his scourging. This was a standard operating procedure for the Romans, and if we look back to the Gospels, we can see that Jesus suffered from the same cruel punishment. So they looked at Paul as a criminal, as we see here, nothing more than a criminal. And they never expected criminals to tell the truth unless it was beaten out of them. Throughout history, many cruel methods have been devised to force the truth from those under suspicion. Other than crucifixion, scourging was the most cruel punishment meted out by the Romans. 4 or 5 leather tongs were attached to a stout wooden handle, and embedded in the tongs were bits of sharp bones and metal. When wielded by a zealous executioner, the scourge opened the flesh at every lash, exposing muscles, tendons, and bones. Many who met this cruel punishment were crippled for life, and some even died, but few survived in their right minds. Paul had been beaten on several occasions, and he describes this in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 and 25. However, he had never undergone Roman scourging. So here we are. We went from Paul being accused of polluting the temple by bringing Gentiles in and teaching them, to Paul giving a defense for his actions, to the Jewish people becoming infuriated and disgusted, ready to hurt Paul, to the chief captain commanding him to be scourged. Here Paul was tied up and stretched over a post, about to meet his punishment. But what happens next? Let me get a reader for verses 25 through 30, and we'll close out there this morning.
If they got over God, God, the person name, Roman. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief council, take heed, brother. Then the chief captain asked them to himself, now, Roman, and he said, yeah. And the chief captain answered, with a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, but I was freeborn. Then straightway they departed from him, which should examine him, and the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. And on the morrow, keep going. On the morrow, because he would have known certainty whereof he was accused of the Jew, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them.
So ultimately, ending our lesson here this morning, we see that Paul confessed that he was a Roman citizen. And in the end, the Roman soldiers confirmed Paul's claim to be valid, and they released him immediately because Roman citizens could not be scourged. I could go into a little bit more background there about the citizenship and how Paul got his citizenship, but we're going to cut it there this morning. Verse 30 tells us that the chief priest would not let Paul off that easy, however. In the next chapter, Paul will have to sit before the Sanhedrin and prepare yet another statement. So we'll close there this morning. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, for your comments and reading of the scriptures. Any more comments or questions before we close? Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. And please stay with us. For those who are joining us online, we will be beginning our worship services at 11 a.m. Again, thank you.